no reason to play musical chairs. If you're fine where you are, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order here. So, it is my pleasure to call this special call meeting of the Mayor and Board of Aldermen for the City of Natchez to order. I will ask everyone to please stand for our prayer, and then following our prayer, we will have our pledge. I want to say, as we pray this morning, I want to encourage everyone to join me also in a special prayer for our comrades in Ukraine, and use this opportunity to just make a statement of support for Ukraine and support for freedom. And I believe lovers of freedom everywhere should join us in praying for these people who very unjustly have been invaded. And our prayer is that the United States and all lovers of freedom will stand firm against aggression and also stand firm for peace. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for this day you've given us, another beautiful day to wake up in a free country, and we don't take that for granted. And Lord, we do ask again, as we do, and we should every day, God bless America. And Father, we do offer prayers to our comrades in Ukraine. And Father, that you would give them strength. And we also lift up to you the families of all of those who already have been lost. And we pray, O Lord, that your peace, a peace that passes all understanding, would come into the midst of that scene of war. Father, we also pray over our own country and over our city. Father, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you that we can gather together today to discuss things that are so important to our future. We thank you for the unity in our community, and along with that, the growing opportunity. And so now, Father, be with us, bless us, be with all those on our hearts. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen. Please join me in offering our pledge to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. We'll ask the clerk to administer the roll call.
Alderwoman Hall.
Here.
Alderman Frazier.
Here.
Alderwoman Smith.
Here.
Alderwoman Irving.
Here.
Alderman Davis.
Here.
Alderman Dillard. Mr. Mayor, all are present and accounted for with the exception of Alderman Dillard.
Thank you. That constitutes a quorum, and we will now move on to the substance of our meeting. This is a special call meeting of the board, but we also have members of the Board of Supervisors here, and we would like to recognize them at this time. And I'm going to ask that the president of the Board of Supervisors be recognized. Supervisor Middleton, if you'll come to the podium and introduce individuals here on behalf of Adams County.
Good morning, everyone.
morning.
Supervisor Angela Hutchins is present, County Attorney Scott Slover, Chancery Clerk Brandy Lewis, and Deputy Clerk Paige Dean. We also have our Airport Director Richard Nelson present.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Supervisor, and or I should say President Middleton. And we also are glad to see John McCullough here, who is the chairman of the commission at the airport, and also Mr. Andre Ware back there on the back row. Dante. Mr. Ware, I've been flying a little too fast, and it's time for me to come down for a landing, I think, soon. Mr. Ware, we appreciate you and appreciate your being here. Do we have any other members of the commission here this morning? All right. With that said, I'd like to turn this meeting over. We've had a lot of good success, a lot of good things happening, and the best person to update on all of that would be our consultant, Jeremiah Gerald, and also we have Mr. Nelson, should we need to, and I'm going to just come out and enjoy the program from where you are sitting.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you guys for having me. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here. And I picked the greatest week. I think the weather is amazing out in Natchez, Mississippi. So just, I know you guys have started this initiative well before my time here, but I've had the the opportunity to work with the mayor, with the airport, with Mr. Nelson over the past couple of months, bringing in some expertise and making some connections. I'd like to lead by saying, obviously, this is a challenging industry, working, with scheduled airlines and scheduled air service, especially when we're dealing with global issues like a pandemic and energy costs. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those challenges. And through those challenges, there's always a silver lining, and it's my job to find those opportunities. And it really is a collective effort of regions, of communities that result in success as it relates to acquiring new air service opportunities here. So let me give you a little bit of background about myself. You can probably hear it in my accent. I'm from the South. I was born and raised in Louisiana. I went to college at Louisiana Tech University, graduated in professional aviation as a pilot. And I'm a part of the pilot shortage issue because I decided to go into the airport space. I worked at Gulfport Biloxi International Airport for 9 years, started in operations, moved into business development, basically a marriage counselor between casinos, government entities, and airlines. And then I eventually was recruited into the consultant world. So I'm an air service development consultant for a company called ASM, Airport Strategy and Marketing. And just to give you a little bit of background about our company, we're an events company primarily, and Forma is the largest events company in the world, based in London. And we fall under an umbrella on that event side under aviation. So my company, ASM, is the consultant arm of that, basically the liaison between communities, airports, and airlines. So we do a lot of events, offering venues to have that dialogue and that interaction with key airlines. Mayor Dan, as well as Richard, have participated in some of those, and I'm happy to say that they're now well known throughout the industry. As you know, Mayor Dan has a lot of energy, and he definitely believes in this market, and it takes that. It's going to take that. It's about relationships, it's about trust, but it's also about passion, belief in something, and working together as a community to accomplish that. So I'm happy to say and report that you certainly have a great team here. So let me give you a little bit of background about what's going on in the industry today. I'm sure you guys watch the news and you hear a little bit about this every now and then on what's happening on the airline side. But as you know, this global pandemic is unprecedented, right? Especially for the aviation industry as a whole. But the good news is we've faced challenges in the past within this industry. If you look back at 9/11, and so that red line is operating revenues and the gray bars are enplaned passengers. So as you can see, we have shocks in the industry that certainly impact us, set us back a bit, but we always recover, and then we recover in full force and then some. So we expect the same to happen as we come out of this pandemic. So new opportunities will arise. But I've been in this industry for about 18 years now, and long enough to know that you take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back a lot of times in this business, because there's a lot of external things that impact decisions, like the cost of energy, staffing shortages, things like that are going to be some new challenges that we face. But we do expect to return to 2019 levels from a holistic view of the industry. By the summer of this year is the optimistic view on when that will happen. So that's a good news. But what's going to kind of meter that or cause an artificial ceiling on opportunities is certainly the cost of energy. It is the single most volatile and the single most largest cost for airlines. So you think we suffer at the pump, you can imagine how much fuel airlines burn through and how much that adds to their overall cost. Just a penny increase in the cost of jet fuel. We're coming back into a pilot shortage issue. So that's industry-wide. Coming out of the 9/11, there was a lot of issues with, the ability to move up in the airline industry and starting at decent pay. That was a part of the reason. And of course, then we had the Colgan crash several years back that raised the minimum hour requirements to become a pilot in the commercial industry. So that, coupled with a lot of retirements, you can see that orange bar is the demand, and you can see that supply right below it. We're certainly at a point where we don't have enough pilots to operate the aircraft that are out there today. So that's already had an impact, and it will continue to have an impact on the industry as a whole. The other thing that we don't talk about a lot is the mechanic side of the business as well. There's also a shortage on the mechanic side, which is extremely important, which will also have an impact going forward. So we're not just sitting back and letting this happen, right? So there's organizations, there's airlines, there's universities that are working together. There's a lot of sign-on bonus opportunities to get people excited to get back into the industry. So we believe it won't be as heavy of a shortage of an issue going forward, but we certainly are feeling the pain of shortages today. And we're seeing, changes to airline networks, unprecedented changes, right? So we have major network carriers who normally fly you to a hub and connect you on to a tourism destination like Orlando, for example, that are now overflying those hubs from major metro areas directly to the destinations, which is not a cost-efficient way to do business with a network carrier like American, Delta, or United. That's not their business model. But they're doing that because that's where the traffic is, right? So it's leisure-driven. It's high-end leisure traffic across the U.S. primarily up until the end of last year. So we still haven't seen that return of corporate travel or even international travel, which is what the Americans and the Deltas and Uniteds of the world rely heavily on. The other thing that we have going is the retirement of the 50-seat regional jet, right? So as energy costs increase, that 50-seat regional jet becomes less efficient because you only have a certain amount of seats. It's an older airplane. It burns a lot of fuel. So you need to upgrade to a larger, newer, more efficient aircraft. So we're seeing that transition. Well, for smaller communities, that means the loss of some frequencies, the loss of airlines altogether. And we're starting to see some of that play out. This is an example. United has probably led the charge on this across all the network carriers. But United has cut, this is an example of something they cut at the beginning of the year. They cut 9 markets completely out of their network: Killeen, College Station, Monroe, being one of those. So United completely leaving those markets because of these reasons. There's staffing shortages, energy costs rising, 50-seat RJs not being viable in some of these markets. And of course, without that return of corporate traffic, they're going to be losing money until that corporate traveler gets back into the air. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. Well, just this week, we had a new announcement from United cutting 17 routes. One of those being in Louisiana, again, Alexandria. And this is completely leaving Alexandria. So United has left Monroe and Alexandria since the beginning of this year. So certainly some headwinds as it relates to your traditional regional flying. And we're going to continue to see some of this as we move throughout the year. We don't see an end in sight on this increase in energy, right? And I mentioned before the impact that has on the airline's bottom line is enormous. This is the TSA traveler throughput data. So this basically measures every single person who goes through a checkpoint in an airport. So it's showing you that blue line is where we were in 2022 coming out of the Omicron variant. But you can see a pretty swift return as we get into February. And we expect certainly by the time we get to summer, we'll be back to where we were prior to the pandemic. Now, filling airplanes is just one side of the business, right? One side of the story. It's great to fill airplanes, but as I mentioned before, the quality of customer that are on these airplanes are not the same that we had prior to the pandemic. We have people who are looking for low fares, going to leisure destinations, and that's really where the demand has been throughout the pandemic, which means fares are low. So you have low fares, lower fares than usual. You don't have that high-end lucrative business traveler or the international customer. And then you have rising energy costs. So those two things are going to kind of, put an artificial ceiling on the ability for the industry to come out of this in 2022. But certainly signs of life. Also, airlines have been burning through a lot of cash. Fortunately, we had the federal government with the CARES program that helped kind of weather the storm, keep people employed. But you can see this is just a percentage of operating revenue compared to 2019 revenues. We won't see full recovery of that until what's forecasted as fourth quarter of 22. So I say all this because I want you guys to understand that the industry, this is a challenging industry, and this is this happens all the time in the industry. It's a continuous up and down of opportunities versus challenges to overcome. So let's talk a little bit about Natchez and the unique opportunity here. So the first step was we need to understand where passengers are going, where they're traveling from this region. So we did a study to define that. So down to the zip code, we know what airport people are using as their point of origin airport to fly out. And we know where their final destination is. And we can flip that around. And we also know where the visitors are what airport they're coming into and where they end their trip within this DMA or this radius around Natchez. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is an excerpt of the business case presentation that we delivered 2 weeks ago out in San Antonio at one of our Roots conferences, where we sit down with airlines, network planning teams, and we deliver a 20-minute presentation, really just trying to give them a snapshot on what's happening on the ground here in Natchez, and how does that relate to, you know, profitability and success within their airline network. That's really what these meetings are about. So we've got Natchez on the map in the airline space today. They didn't know Natchez existed before the past couple months, so now we're in front of these guys, which is a huge step. We also have a great airport, right? So Mr. Nelson and his team, we have an airport that's ready to go. It's Part 139 certified. I've worked with many airports across the U.S., some GA airports that haven't had that 139 certification, and it's an enormous task to get there. A lot of money has to be spent, a lot of time and energy. So the good news is we already have that box checked here. We also have the required firefighting equipment. So we're Index A, which will allow us to serve the carriers that we're pursuing. We also have an airport operated fuel FBO, fuel station. And then we have adequate runway as well. That's another important factor. We have over 6,500 feet in length, and we have 150-foot wide runway with an instrument approach. So just speaking about air service development, it'd be great if you can just present all this to an airline and they would say, yes, this is something that we want to do, and we're going to our asset into Natchez and hope people fly on that airplane. That's just simply not the way the world works. So we have to create a structure. We have to collaborate, and we have to make sure that the users of this potential service are at the table discussing the utilization of that and helping the airline be successful in this market. There also needs to be risk mitigation funding. So it's a huge undertaking for an airline to launch service especially from a market that hasn't had service many, many years. Creating awareness, there's a huge risk associated with that. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars annually that the airline would incur if the service wasn't successful. So we've already started that process of risk mitigation funding. And what I'm here to talk to you about today is the DOT has a small community air service development grant that they offer to medium hub airports and down, which enables the airport to access federal dollars coupled with a public-private match to use that to offset the risk to get an airline in the door into the community. I'll give you some examples. I've written many of these, and I've won many of these. So last year I won one for Killeen Fort Hood worth $1.3 million. Just executed one out of Columbus, Georgia for introduction of American Airlines service to Charlotte and Dallas in direct competition with Delta Airlines. So these things work. I know that these things work, and this is something that we want to pursue here. Now, I will preface by saying that this is not guaranteed, right? So it's a very competitive world out there. There's a lot of airports that are fighting to get access to these funds so they can grow their air service. Every community is just as aggressive, in some cases maybe more aggressive than the Natchez to date. Now we're ramping up the aggression, and we're trying to get a lot of these things in place. But I definitely say applying for it is one step, but we've got to expect that when we apply for this grant, there's a likelihood that we may not win it in year one. We may not win it in year two. I've had airports that have written the same grant for 3 years and won it on the third year. So it's a time. It may take time. So we'll work through that. But then there's also a local state program designed to support air service development efforts as well that I'll talk to you about at the beginning of this thing, which really came out of Gulfport Biloxi around gaming. I just want to run through this quickly. So this is the things that we're presenting to the airline. So we start by showing them what is the population base throughout the region. What is the GDP? Is the GDP growing? That's what one of the first things that airlines look at when they're looking to invest in a community in a region is, are we seeing growth? Is there disposable income? Is there corporate travel? And it usually comes out initially in the GDP. We also want to give them some information about the type of things that would drive traffic in both directions to this market. So we talk about tourism. We talk about the growth in employment. We discuss the unique aspects of what makes the tourism product here at Natchez unique, and why people, especially now in today's world, are seeking out markets like this for cultural tourism, for ecotourism. Certainly has some very unique aspects for this region. And then things like river cruises that are potentially going to bring customers into this market to utilize these services out of Natchez. So we go through, things like Natchez Trace. So we give them a good idea on what's happening from a tourism perspective. But this is really what is driving a lot of the discussion, I think, and is really going to catapult Natchez up the list on priorities for potential air service, is the business community and the type of business, the type of manufacturing, these biofuels, these energy-driven companies. Certainly, one of the big announcements where we see a lot of traffic to and from Houston, for example, is the Velocities announcement, right? The investment that's taking place here over the next couple of years has certainly already begun to drive traffic to and from energy markets like Houston and Midland and places like that. So the energy sector is certainly a big deal here, and that's going to be a category of employer in this region that's going to get the attention of the airlines. Film as well. We pulled the data for 2019, calendar year 2019, and I know there's a lot of film activity going on during that year. So it's funny that we see the number one market for this community in calendar year 2019 was Los Angeles. By far, it was the number one market in and out of the Natchez community, and obviously that was driven a lot by the film industry. So that's certainly something that we want to showcase. All the growth, all the different investments in growth and what that means as it relates to jobs and disposable income, certainly put on showcase when we meet with the airline representatives. So this is just some examples. And then, building permits, record-breaking home sales, things like that are exactly what the airlines are looking for. They need to see that disposable income. They need to see that growth and investment taking place within the region. And it's certainly happening here within this Natchez region. So I mentioned before the catchment analytics data, right? So we did a study to where we could identify down to the zip code where people are traveling to and from, right? So this is the results of that study. And the way we source this data, we use online behavioral data. So when people are online, living around this area, searching for flights, if they say, oh, I need a flight from Alexandria to Los Angeles, for example, that's going to get weighted very high in the scale because they're very specific about what they're searching for. But if they're just looking for flights to Florida, it's going to get weighted really low. But there's hundreds of millions of searches that are going on. And we have computer programs that, with these algorithms that right size and actually point it to an IP address, down to a zip code, down to a location. We right size it with census data that tells us what the income levels are, what the population base is for that region. And then we also have DOT survey data where we true passenger traffic from the surrounding airports. So we have it down to science, basically. So we know exactly where people are coming and where they're going. We also know that we're somewhat insulated. We're somewhat insulated from large airport competitors. So being this far away from access to the global air transportation network is certainly a hindrance for business growth in this region. It affects the quality of life. It impacts the overall cost to do business in this market. That's why it's important to have local access to a global transportation network. And we're going to talk about how we plan to do that. So just looking, this is just some of the data down to the zip code, as I mentioned before. So we know, so PDU stands for passengers per day each way. It's just a very simplified way of looking at demand as it relates to air travel. We know what the monthly passengers are. We know what the quarterly and the annual. But from an airline perspective, they want to see it, what is the average travel per day. And so this surprised a lot of people. There's actually about 490 passengers per day each way that are flowing in and out of this 60-mile radius surrounding Natchez. And you can see where the zip codes that are generating the majority of that traffic are, one of them being right where the airport sits, right? About 70, just under 70 passengers per day each way are traveling to and from that zip code on average. Maybe certain times of the year we're going to see more tourist traffic, right? But this is the average for the year. So it's about 70 a day just down to the zip code. And you can see most of it is actually originating here. It's starting here and it's traveling out. So about 62% is actually originating here. And then you can see the break all the way down. It's really three main zip codes that generate the largest majority of traffic. And what airports are they using? So that's the other thing. So where are they going? We need to know what airports they're using, and we also need to know what airlines they're using. So if we're approaching an airline that's getting 80% of the traffic, trying to get them to fly from Natchez, it's probably not a great business case because they're already getting the traffic at another airport. So we need to know that so we can create the business case and target the right airlines. So you can see a lot of people are driving down to New Orleans. And of course, can you imagine what airline they're flying when they get to New Orleans? Southwest, exactly. Jackson, Mississippi. That's more of a business-centric market. Can you imagine what airline they're flying out of there? Delta, actually. Delta out of Jackson. And then Baton Rouge. And then another interesting one that jumps out, even ahead of Alexandria, is Houston. So there's people that are actually driving from this market all the way down to Houston, likely to do business in Houston, and then they're getting on an airplane and flying out from there. So that's a long drive. And we know that there's a synergy between here and energy-driven markets like Houston because of the type of business. So that's certainly an angle that we're pursuing. So when it goes to New Orleans, like I mentioned before, the top market where people are traveling is Orlando. This is where you got your families that are wanting to go on vacation. They want to get a cheaper fare, so they fly Southwest to a lot of these destinations when they go to New Orleans. When they go to Jackson, the top local market is Atlanta. So they fly from Jackson to Atlanta to do business in Atlanta. The one right behind that is your Reagan, your Washington, D.C. market. And you can see Delta gets the majority of the traffic at 18.4 a day. And when it drives down to Houston, it flows to Western markets primarily, like Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Denver. And you can see United is actually getting a good share of that. Certainly energy-driven business that's traveling to and from in this respect. So again, Southwest getting the largest share out of New Orleans, right behind that Delta, and then American behind that. And again, I wanted to we know where people are going as well. So I know this is kind of small for these screens, but Los Angeles, as you can see, 27 passengers per day each way flew in and out of that 60-mile radius surrounding Natchez in 2019. So certainly a significant destination where we need to get access. As I understand, we have a lot of films coming up this year, so I expect this to be important. This will be ramping up again. So how do we get into these networks? What are some key networks that we need to get access to? One of those certainly is Dallas, right? Getting access directly into the American Airlines network on a ticket that you purchase here in Natchez, right? You want to be able to buy an American ticket, get on an airplane out at HEZ, and then you want to be able to fly directly into Dallas. Your bag connects onto American flight seamlessly, right? You're already in security. That's what we want. And it's actually not a bad stage length. It's only about a little less than an hour's flight between here and there, 347 statute miles. Another one, which is even a shorter stage length, would be Houston. So Houston is 265 statute miles, and it's only about 40 minutes one way. The flight would only be about 40 minutes. So, and of course, both of those networks are global networks. You can get to anywhere in the world over Dallas or Houston within either the American or the United network. And that's what we want. That's key for this market. So how do we get there? Well, I just mentioned before that United is cutting flights left and right in communities that have had air service since the beginning of time, right? So the approach is certainly not to go after 50-seat regional jet aircraft to try to get them to take a risk in a market like Natchez. So we need to start somewhere where it's reasonable, where we can manage it. So there's carriers out there like Southern Airways Express, Boutique Airways, that have interline agreements with American and United. Interline agreement means, yeah, you may start that flight going into the hub on a different airline, but you're going to be flying on American ticket. And it'll be a seamless process when you get to the hub. It's a smaller aircraft. It's a way to build air service, and you get access to that global network. That's key. We can get an airline to fly from point A to point B and bring you to Nashville, for example, but not connect you anywhere. You connect yourself, which creates a lot of havoc and a lot of issues, right? Or you can work with a smaller operator to get into a hub where you have a network and you have opportunities for multiple flights across the globe. And that's the key. So Boutique also has a presence in Dallas-Fort Worth, and they also have an airline agreement. So these aircraft that these airlines operate are turboprop airplanes. So they operate the Caravan, which is a 9-seat airplane. They operate a Pilatus, and then they also have King Airs as well. These are short stage flights. So this is a very short flight on a turboprop aircraft, and then you connect seamlessly into the American network. So that's the key, or the United network. So let's talk about how we get there, right? So with any airline, there's risk. There's an enormous amount of risk. With an airline like Southern Airways Express or a boutique, there's what they have typically done is flown in and out of markets that have a subsidy attached to them, right? So we have what we call essential air service airports across the U.S. So they're in perpetuity. Federal government is subsidizing those airlines to fly there, so they can have access to them because it's required that they get access to the global transportation system. In our case, we don't have the luxury of an EAS program, but we do have opportunities through grant programs where we can raise funding to offset the risk. So we'll talk about some of those. So this DOT, this is an upcoming program that's available this year. There's $17 million available in this program. And again, I mentioned before, I've written many of these. We've won many of these. But it's to provide temporary financial assistance to small communities in order to gain or improve access to the National Air Transportation System is the purpose of this fund. So what are the requirements? So we need to have, we need to be less than a small hub airport, the size of smaller than a small hub airport. As we know, we're a general aviation airport, so we certainly meet that requirement. We have to show that we have insufficient air service. We can certainly meet that requirement. We don't have air service, number one, and then the cost and the time to get to an airport certainly puts us at a competitive disadvantage. So unreasonably high fares. When we talk about high fares, even though people are driving and maybe getting a reasonable fare out of New Orleans, we're not taking into account the cost to get there, right? So once you add in that cost to get there, it's actually putting us in a higher category to enter the national air or the global air transportation system. So we can certainly show that in the proposal that we will submit. And then we have to also show that this air service is going to impact more than a single entity. We have to show that having access to a market like Dallas and an American network or Houston with United will impact a very diverse group of people within this community. And we can clearly show that, especially when we're talking about hub service to multiple nonstop destinations. So let's talk about how we get there. So SCASD fund recipients must adequately define an active public and private partnership. I can tell you that that's in the top three of what the DOT is going to be looking for. And that's part of the reason why we're having this meeting here today. We have to show the DOT that we are educating the community, that we have stakeholders within the community that are actively involved and participating in this process. We're going to list this meeting in the proposal that we had this meeting today, and we shared this information with you guys. And we've had several meetings in the past leading up to this as well. The key here on the funding is we need an average between 20 and 30% match of what we're asking of the DOT to provide. And I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. The good news is we have the match dollars already through the county and the city. The money is there to provide a match for this particular grant. So let's talk about what we want to apply for. So there's really two things that we can apply for. One is marketing funds to promote the region. And you typically would apply for those if you already have air service, right? So are you trying to add some air service to an existing airline that's at your facility? In this case, we don't have an airline. So we're trying to lower that bar, that risk for that airline to get in the door. So they provide funding for what you call a minimum revenue guarantee program, an MRG for short. So the minimum revenue guarantee program basically is an agreement between the airport and the airline that identifies what the cost to operate from point A to point B will be based on a schedule, based on the cost of fuel at the time, and then they set a revenue threshold. Once that revenue threshold is met, there's no payment required whatsoever. The airline operates as usual. If there's a shortfall on a quarterly basis, when they run the numbers, we fall below that line, then this risk mitigation fund, the revenue guarantee, will then make them whole, right? And I'll give you an example of what that looks like here in a moment. This is just a potential breakdown of what it would look like on our application. So we would ask the federal government for $750,000 for a minimum revenue guarantee program. We would match that with about $200,000 in public-private support, which gives us an MRG of about $950,000, which is adequate for a small operator like Southern Airways or a boutique. We then have to show that there's a marketing program that's attached to that, because the DOT will not give you $1 million if they don't know that you're going to actively promote it and make sure that service is successful. So then we have to show that there is money that's allocated to support that service in a marketing program. So this is just an example of one that I believe that would be the right fit, the right size for the airline that we're pursuing here. It comes out to about $1,075,000. That would be a reasonable MRG program for multiple flights, by the way. We're not talking about one 9-seat aircraft to Dallas. We're talking about 3 or 4 flights a day on a 9-seat aircraft to Dallas, giving you access to multiple connections, multiple hub connections. So this is just the kind of, I'm sure you guys probably get this already, but I like to show this, how this thing works. So an MRG is at-risk money. It's not money that you're just giving to an airline and saying, we hope you do well. It's money that only is used if the airline is struggling. And we need to get them through that first 6 to 9 months until they get the awareness up and people start using the service. So this is an example of a payout. So if there's a $10,000 payout in a quarterly period that we needed to pay to make the airline whole, the DOT, it's a reimbursable grant. So the payment would have to be made by the airport because they would be the sponsor. And then they would be reimbursed by the DOT for, in this case, 78 to 79%, which is about $7,800. And then that public-private match that we showed is what we pick up the remaining. That's how this grant works. So there's a good chance that no payment is ever made from that MRG. None of that money is ever spent. But it needs to be there in order to lower the risk and to actually raise the opportunity for Natchez being a viable option in the eyes of airlines that don't know anything about Natchez or are risk averse because of where we are in today's world. I want to talk briefly about the MDA program. So this MDA program was actually created primarily, it started from the BP oil spill funds. I actually took part in helping write some of the language. Clay Williams, the director down in Gulfport, Biloxi, played a major role in putting this together. So basically, it provides up to $2.5 million annually for things like revenue guarantees, seat guarantees, or seat cost mitigation, ground handling costs, right? There's a cost to have people on the ground at the airport and the equipment associated with that. So you can get money for marketing as well, and you can do it, one or the other or both. You can apply for both. But here's the key: that eligible applicants. So the key here is any certified Part 121 air carrier that provides additional new services or new services to the community. But if you read on, it says in Mississippi in which legal gaming is being conducted or is authorized. That have Part 121 air service at the time. So that limits this grant opportunity to just a small group of airports in Mississippi. So we believe that we have a shot because of the gaming presence here at potentially applying for this and also using this as a risk mitigation tool, similar to what Gulfport has been doing since the introduction of this grant program. They've gotten a lot of new air service. Allegiant is there because of this. Sun Country has added new nonstop destinations because of this. So we should be taking advantage of this. Any opportunity that we certainly have to get access to these funds, that's the plan, that's the goal, and I think that's key. Now, we already have a great fund. We have $500,000 that's been allocated by the city and the county collectively. That could technically possibly be enough to get an airline like Southern in the door. But we certainly, while we have that fund, we want to try to leverage it and get as much support as possible. And we have this window of opportunity. March 15th is the deadline for the Small Community Air Service Development Grant. So next week, I'll be writing that proposal. What will be important from local stakeholders, from the community? We need letters of support. We need a letter that basically states, this is why scheduled air service at Natchez, Mississippi is important to my business, to me individually. And this is what, this is how I'm going to be actively involved in this partnership to make sure this service is successful. That needs to be attached to our proposal. The DOT is going to want to see that. It's going to back up our public-private partnership section in the grant. Then we also, going forward, we know what the data tells us, right? So we know that there's travel going to and from, but we need to work with every entity within the community to define who's traveling. Why are they traveling? So, for example, the energy sector, we need to start sitting down, meeting with those companies and discussing what are their needs? What are they having to do today to get to the destination? And will this airline solve the problem for them? Will this save them money? Will this enable them to grow? and will they participate with the air service that we would be introducing here? All that is extremely important. In a community like Natchez, I work in a lot of communities across the U.S., and I find the smaller communities, the better, because you have a handful of key stakeholders that you can get in front of, and you can kind of get your arms around what's actually driving the traffic. In these big cities, it's like finding a needle in a haystack, and it takes time. But I believe here we have a good opportunity at introducing this service. We already see an enormous amount of support from the city and county and several of the stakeholders, and that's what it's going to take to get us on the field of play and to ultimately, hopefully, get new nonstop air service options from Natchez, Mississippi. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I'll open it to any questions if you guys have anything that you any specifics that you need.
Mr. Gerald, I have a question for you before we
Yes, sir.
open it up. So the letters of support that we provided in November, we have about that many. Will they suffice? They're dated November
Yeah,
or October.
I think what we really want on the letters is, it's not about more the letters, it's the content in the letters.
Mhm.
So if we have 5 key letters with large corporations that we know will be using the service, will be more important than just a bunch of letters that say, hey, we want air service at Natchez.
Okay.
It needs to be really targeted because a lot of communities do that. They just send out a template letter and they just get people to sign it and then just attach to the grant. The DOT can see right through that. It needs to be very targeted, and it needs to be an entity that's going to actually it's going to impact their business, and they're going to clearly say that in the letter.
Okay. All right. What are some of the key points then that they should make when they're writing that letter?
I think the biggest thing is to discuss the challenges that they face without nonstop air service access in the community. Start there. What does this cause? What issue does this cause for me? Mm-hmm. Is this, is it monetary? Of course, it's going to be a monetary issue, but is it an issue that's causing that business or that individual, undue cost and undue stress? All that can be put in that letter, but it needs to show that there's a need. It needs to show that there's a need, and I'm here to support it. Okay. And I'm working with the airport, and I'm working with these guys in the airline to make this happen.
Okay. All right. At this time, I just want to remind everyone we are in a special call board meeting, and so this is an important meeting for everyone to have input in what we're doing. And so I would like to entertain a motion from our board that we would suspend our rules and open the floor for general discussion at this time. Motion made by Alderwoman Hall, seconded by Alderwoman Smith. Are there any opposed to the motion? We'll ask for a vote. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Motion carries. So we are open for comments and questions for Mr. Gerald. Yes, Judge Heidelberg, good to see you back there. We'll ask you when you are asking questions, for the sake of our online listeners, to please come up and approach the podium. All right.
Okay. Anthony Heidelberg for Magnolia Bluffs Casino. Is there any way to circulate a bullet point document that will give us enough information to formulate the letters that you need, that will hit all the target points that we need to have?
Yes.
So that everybody will be clear and concise and how it affects them, just as what you're discussing now.
Mm-hmm.
So we won't have anything that's glossing over something, but giving you exactly what you need.
Yes, sir. We can go even a step further. I have multiple examples of really good letters that we received from other communities, gaming as well. I think I have some examples for gaming, so I'll definitely circulate that around.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great. I also want to make a comment for everyone to understand. The airport is owned by the county, and the city, though, and this really started. I want to just point to you, Supervisor Hutchins. Last year, during your term as president of the Board of Supervisors, you and I began working on this together. And then during that process, the city was invited to partner on some of the expense of getting this done. And we are so grateful to the county and President Middleton. We just want to express our appreciation that now we are able to partner with you in setting aside this $500,000, which is so important, as we've seen by the presentation. And so with that said, we will continue to be happy to to fill a role as a liaison or moderator or whatever you want to call it. But just know any information that's shared with us, it will be disseminated also through joint participation between the city and the county. But Jeremiah, please send that sample,
Yes.
and we'll get it distributed.
Well, and I want to add to that because I work in a lot of communities, and it's usually the opposite, right? To where you're working with one entity like the county or maybe a city, and it's always a challenge to try to get the two to work together. But in this case, because of the leadership shown by the city, it's been an easy process, which sometimes it takes years to get to this point. So I think it's just the vision and the leadership that's really helped us to get here. So looking at both the county and the city there, I mean, this is a case study on how you're supposed to do it.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Alderman
I
Frazier.
have a question.
Go to the podium, please.
Alderman Frazier, yes, if you could approach the podium, or you may want to come
I'm sorry.
so that you'll be on the microphone. The listeners online need to be able to hear.
My concern is that you said something that there's the major hub carriers you had in Alexandria and Monroe. You had two major carriers that pull out of Alexandria and Monroe. Also, I'm fully aware that Greenville, Mississippi have an airport, and I'm saying that we're going to be in competition with Greenville, Vicksburg, and Vicksburg is 60 miles from Natchez, so that is one of my basic concerns. And Baton Rouge is 80 miles from Natchez, so as you stated in your report that most of the people in Natchez either fly out. Some of the people fly out of Baton Rouge or either New Orleans. So this is my concern that and like I say, I stated about that Alexander and Monroe, they done pulled out. But those places was big hubs in North Louisiana.
Yeah.
That's my concern.
Yeah, and I think it's a valid concern to bring it up. So the difference here, though, is what we're speaking to is what they're doing in Alexandria and Monroe is obviously those companies and what's happening in those communities is very different than what's happening here in Natchez locally. The fact that we don't have, so these are our passengers. These are Natchez passengers that don't have access to the national transportation, so they have to go to other communities to fly. So these are ours. That's number one. We start by identifying that this is our traffic. We don't need to share those with any other airport. People that live here, we're trying to give them an advantage on getting access to the system, the transportation system here. But the other thing is when we talk about United, for example, so the 50-seat RJ in a lot of communities it's going to be pulled down. There'll be several communities across the U.S. that will continue to lose some of that regional air service. The key, though, here is we're not looking for regional air service. We're looking for a niche service in Southern Airways or a boutique, which is a very different category of those markets of that airline that pulled out of both Alexandria and Monroe. So, yeah, I see where you're coming from, and I definitely see the point there. But the key here is to provide, the reason why the airport exists is to provide, in this case, if we're getting into the scheduled airline game, it's there to provide economic prosperity for the region, right? Accessibility is why it's an economic catalyst, an economic development catalyst. And in order to do that, we need access to the National Air Transportation System. It's going to create jobs at the airport. It's going to be direct and indirect and induce jobs within the community. So it's an economic development initiative.
But like I said, I say this because, like I say, Vicksburg is 60 miles from here. Vicksburg basically is something similar to Natchez. Both of us are tourist town.
Yeah.
And we're in competition for
Well, Vicksburg doesn't have
Marvel-
scheduled service. They don't have scheduled airline service out of
but
Vicksburg.
they have an airport. But but that's why I'm concerned because, like I say, tourism is their number one interest, like Natchez.
Yeah, we can help bring in tourists to Vicksburg,
They have
actually.
gambling and everything else. So,
Yeah.
So that was my basic concern.
And
I brought that up.
Greenville's a good point, though. Greenville, EAS, they have scheduled air service, but it's with I don't know who the carrier is off the top of my head, but it's a smaller carrier, and it's subsidized by Contour. It's subsidized by the federal government already. So as you can see from the data, people from this area aren't going to Greenville to fly today. So we're not going to be taking or moving any traffic to and from Greenville. If anything, we would help Vicksburg and some of those other airports, give them another outlet to get people in and out. So, but yeah, I see where you're coming from there. Thank you for bringing up that point.
Thank you.
Yes, Alderwoman Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mine is really more advice or information about, if you look at what size carrier we go with, if it's one that we would not have TSA here, and R1 versus where we would, because it's 60% or 39120, is that what I heard? 60% of the travelers?
Out of, yeah.
Yeah,
part of the-
which is
the
good,
Natchez zip
which
code,
is
yeah.
good. So in our 60-mile radius, for those, maybe 40% would probably go to a larger airport if they had to go through TSA
Yeah.
when they got to their next destination. So I guess my advice is what you think what we should do at this time versus TSA versus no TSA.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that would have to work through. First, we need to get the airline interested. We need to raise the funds. So I didn't mention this before. So if we win an MRG fund from the DOT, we have that money for 5 years. So we can, it doesn't have to be used immediately. And I don't expect that the airline will launch this year. I think it's something that it's going to be a longer term solution. But we want that money in our back pocket. We need the tools in the toolbox in order to be on the field of play so we can aggressively introduce air service at some point when the time is right. But TSA, the key though, is even with Southern, we'd want to work with TSA to get people screened here so we can have that seamless experience when you get to the hub airport. That's the key. And that's part of the reason why we're pursuing carriers like Southern and Boutique is it's not an enormous undertaking. The airport is not big enough for a 150-seat airplane. It needs to be small. We need to grow gradually. And then this is the way to get into the door to start, and multiple flights a day, 18 seats, almost 30 seats a day is a reasonable amount of seats to get to and from a major hub like that. It's a good way to start. You're not taking on an enormous amount of risk. You don't have to have all the infrastructure updates that are required for larger airplanes. So that's why we're starting with the Southern and the Boutique option. And certainly we would push for pre-screening here before you get to the hub. That's going to be key.
That makes sense. Because
Yeah.
the people that are an hour each way, it's worth it for them to come here.
That's where Mr. Nelson comes in and working with the TSA. But the TSA won't even entertain that idea unless you have, you have something at the table that's viable.
What time period does it take to get a TSA? Once you get an airline?
That's a good question. So a good example is Gulf Shores, Orange Beach is another airport that I've been working with the past 3 years. And this year they're going to finally launch new scheduled service, which I can't say who it's going to be, but they've worked through that process. They didn't have 139 certification. So they spent millions of dollars over the past couple of years to get the 139. And then the next phase is to build a terminal facility. And they just identified a private company to do that for them just a couple of weeks ago to launch service at the end. So, and they're still having challenges to get TSA on, they know TSA will participate, but the timing of when TSA participates, they're trying to speed it up. So, but the conversations, it's kind of difficult to go to them and say, hey, we're working on getting air service. Can you tell us when you could be in my airport? It's easier to say, hey, we have an airline. This is the date when we want to launch. What do we need to do to get you here? That's kind of where we're trying to get to that point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
House Bill 1074.
Mr. Slover, will you go to the mic?
Mr. Slover, yeah, you might need to come to the mic.
House Bill 1074, when was that adopted?
The MBA program, I believe that was in 2016. I believe it's 2016 or 17.
All right. Other questions, discussion? I want to just make a point. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the grant is being applied for in the name of the commission and the airport. So therefore, the action that we've taken as a board, the action that the county's taken to provide the funds, that's all that we have to do. We don't have to make any official action with regard to the grant because that's been made by the airport commission. Am I right? I just wanted to clarify that. I had gotten a question about that. Okay. Any further discussion? The deadline is March 15th. We will get this information disseminated. I want to just thank everyone for being here and for helping us on this. I know that Visit Natchez, the Chamber of Commerce, and also Natchez Inc., y'all have all been helping us disseminate this information. And so obviously we've got more to do and to get those more targeted letters in. Also, we'll go back through the letters we have. We'll make sure you have those before you leave today, so you can go back through them and mark the ones that are really good.
Yeah.
That we might can just use in their present form.
There's no harm in putting them in there, but I definitely want to put those key letters in the beginning, the ones that I know that they're going to see.
Okay.
But yeah,
Right.
the more support, the better.
Okay.
Right?
Great. I also want to just say we've had some really great discussions with service providers, and it is exciting to again see Natchez at the conference. As the old saying goes, if you really want to dance, you got to go to the dance, and otherwise you're going to get left behind. I have gotten conflicting information. One thing I'd love to settle today, I've been told it's been 20 years, 30 years. We had a small service Andy Peabody had here, the last commercial service. How long has it really been? I'd like to know.
It's in the 90s. 70s, I think it might be 75, 76.
Well, he had a small carrier in the 90s.
About somewhere.
In the 90s. So it's safe to say about 30 years. Yes.
Pomeroy, I was here.
Yeah. If you would come to the mic, Mr. Pomeroy, thank you.
The service was originally with Southern Airways, and in 1975, Southern was replaced by SCAT. SCAT Airline operated for a number of years. They were replaced by Air Illinois for a period of time. And then Air Illinois was replaced by Royale Airlines based out of Shreveport for a number of years. And we ended service here, I think, probably in the late 90s.
Okay.
Then we had a very brief period of 2 months and 9 days with an airline out of Texas that didn't make it. And that was the history of our air service at Natchez.
So it's safe to say over 20 years. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Ms. Pomeroy. Yes, Alderwoman Hall.
Yes, sir. I would like to thank the city, through your leadership, Mr. Callaway, Mr. Slover, Board of Supervisors, both presidents, with this partnership that we have attained to do this. And also Mr. Nelson and Mr. Gerald and the Airport Commission for all of the work that you all have done, all the data. You've really done all the legwork and all of this in order for this to happen. And we have met some of the qualifications, so I think this is a great possibility that this will happen for us.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I'm very excited. This is definitely a win-win, a game changer for our area, and we know it's going to happen. And Supervisor Hutchins, I will never forget when we made that trip, a few of us, and I remember Richard Nelson went along with us, and also President Middleton, you were there. We visited the Greenville Airport, and we want to give thanks to Mayor Eric Fleming, a friend of mine there, and also the director, Mr. Washington, there at the airport. Little did we know that visit about a year ago would result in so many good discussions, good things. And then truly, I've just got to say, Mr. Nelson, your leadership, just being around this guy at the conference in San Antonio a couple of weeks ago was really eye-opening. He's got a lot of friends in the industry. Richard Nelson is such a modest, humble public servant, and we are very, very blessed to have him in Natchez. And I don't think this would be happening for us without his leadership. And so thank you, Mr. Nelson. And I also want to say John McCullough and Mr. Dante Ware, we just have the perfect commission in place, and it's happening under your watch, and we're very grateful for that. I want to give a shout out to Devin Heath. Today is Devin's 1 year anniversary on the job at Visit Natchez. And Devin, I have a little reason for giving you that shout out, because Visit Natchez is going to be an extremely important partner to this in helping market these flights. This will be one more tool in the toolbox at Visit Natchez in promoting tourism here. And also Mr. Walter Tipton, on behalf of our conference center, and y'all do such a great job. And it was so good seeing Mr. Ruther last night at our event. You know, this is a chance to move our conferences to that next level. And so marketing is going to be a big part of this, and having marketing included and freely available to the carriers is a big selling point. And so I'd like for us to make sure that we communicate with Mr. Gerald. May want to have a little visit just after this meeting. Devin, y'all might want to connect, and Mr. Tipton, y'all might want to connect, because I could easily see on the websites and on the push emails a link to the airport for flight information to and from Natchez. Click here. And that way, tourists who are looking for a great opportunity to plan a trip to Natchez immediately have a link for how they can fly. Just
Mr.
wanted
Mayor, one more thing. I would be
Yes,
remiss
Alderwoman
not to
Hall.
mention Chandler Russ and Amy Guido from Natchez Inc. and their role in this
Yes.
also, a major role in this.
In
Yeah,
fact,
Amy played a huge role in a lot of the data, the community stuff. So couldn't have done it without her. Thank her.
thank you, Amy. Thank you, Alderwoman Hall. Well, we're about done. Anything else to be said? All right. Well, y'all, it's exciting celebrating all this progress, and it all comes when we work together.
Working together.
We'll now entertain a motion to
So
adjourn.
moved.
Motion made by Alderwoman Hall, seconded by Alderwoman Smith. Are there any opposed to the motion? Hearing none, motion carries. Thank you so much, everyone. Mr.